If you would turn to James chapter 4, and I'll explain why in a little bit, but go ahead and turn to that. We're going to do a Bible study today that I think when it's all done, it'll probably take 3 sessions. Not necessarily will the second one come right away. It might be a month or two or after the Feast of Tabernacles. But I want to do a series on the origins of the American Indians. And this is the first. This is, if you want a subtitle for this Bible study, it would be the Cultural Overview. Origin of the American Indians, a cultural overview. Let me give a little background before I get into this. I have a tribe that I identify with a lot of the American Indian tribes. It's the Oglala. It's one of the Sioux tribes. It's perhaps one of the most illustrious. At least they generated a whole ton of great war chiefs in their day. The first one, my daughter's reading a book about him, is Red Cloud. And Red Cloud was a Tecumseh of the West. If you read about Tecumseh, he was from here in Ohio. He was a Shawnee, one of the Shawnee tribes. And he put together a large coalition of tribes back during the War of 1812. He was actually, when he was finishing up his work as an ambassador, of drawing them all together behind him in order to try to drive all of the Americans back to the sea, at least past the Cumberland Mountains, if not clear into the ocean. He saw the strength of America by having all of these fires, meaning the states, united, and it seems to be where he got the idea. So then he strove, Tecumseh did, to organize the tribes. He was a Shawnee. As I said, the Shawnee were largely based in Ohio. So were some of the Delaware were transplanted here. The Mingo, actually the Delaware, I believe, were in fact Mingo, part of the Mingo Tribal Alliance. Of course, you had the Iroquois and the Algonquins up in the north and in the northeast. He had contacts with them. He had contacts with the Sauk and the Fox in Wisconsin and Michigan, as well as clear over further into Minnesota, where the Sioux were centered at the time. The Sioux moved quite a little bit. He moved, Tecumseh went down and contacted the Cherokee and the Choctaw, that's not how it's said, Choctaw and the Chickasaw. There we go. Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Cherokee. Got them into his alliance, and he went clear down to Alabama and Florida and had the Creeks and their related tribes all in agreement with him to come and fight the Americans during the time, eventually was to be the time of the War of 1812. Pardon me, this may be a challenge. I'll try not to talk so fast where I dry my throat out. Oh, I'm going to put it up in front of us here so I can grab it quicker. Tecumseh managed to make the alliance. Excuse me. But he had a younger brother who was sort of his medicine man, ambassador, and Tenskwatawa, I believe is how his name was said. And he managed to blow their cover. He didn't have anywhere near the self-control and the judgment of Tecumseh. Consequently, the alliance was a fraction of what it could have been, and they had to join the British in the course of the War of 1812. Apologize for the coughing. I was sick for about 4 days this past week with this bronchial condition and, sinus infection I evidently got during Challenger East. Okay, so that was Tecumseh. Red Cloud was of the Oglala Sioux. The Sioux have a number of tribes in the Sioux Nation, or Lakota Nation, as sometimes they go by Lakota, Dakota, or Sioux. Those are all very, oh, thank you, Molly. Should have thought of that. Nothing like a cough drop when you're coughing. Red Cloud, of the tribes of the Sioux, the main tribes, Oglala seemed to be the dominant war-making tribe, at least in all the histories I've seen so far. But you had the Minnehaha, the Yankton, the Brule, the Rosebud, although it was another name. Rosebud's the English name for it. And the Hunkpapa, as well as the Teton Sioux. The Hunkpapa were a fairly notable tribe of the Sioux because that was Sitting Bull's tribe. And Sitting Bull was probably the greatest ambassador the Sioux had, as well as, a genuinely wise man concerned for his people when he saw that they had no chance of defeating the U.S. Army. The Oglala generated Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, that would have been the time of Sitting Bull, Gall, and then there was one other war chief, Low Dog. Low Dog was not a handsome man, but he was was a brave one. I've got photographs of him. Low Dog, Gall, and Crazy Horse were the ones that fought and defeated General Custer. Sitting Bull was not a war chief, but he was in charge of the Sioux encampment. The Oglala ran the war, or the battle. It was really just one battle. So we have a number of these tribes over time. We know that the Cherokee tried to assimilate into American society back here on the East Coast with little success because of President Jackson. They had changed from living in wigwams to living in log homes. They wrote down their language, developed their own alphabet. They did all that they could, in many ways, to assimilate, to become more Americanized, as that were, and still retain their tribal identity. And then they were all removed from the East and sent to Oklahoma, out on the far frontier, by President Jackson, that was what the Trail of Tears was called. And I suppose you could say that American Indian history has been a trail of tears. To go back a little bit to my own personal contact with them, I grew up in Oglala territory. We were 10 miles from the edge of Pine Ridge Reservation, which is the second largest Indian reservation in the United States. That's in western South Dakota, just east of the southern end of the Black Hills. My mother spent 17 years as a teacher in the elementary school down there on the reservation. And before that, she and my father had been for, I think it was about 12 years, foster parents, only to work with, excuse me, with Indian kids. I call them Indians because they call themselves Indians. They don't call themselves Native Americans. But if it makes you feel better, I'll throw that in from time to time. That was Columbus's mistake. He thought he'd made it to India. He'd only made it to the Caribbean. But he didn't know. His maps weren't good. AAA was out of business when he left. How was he to know? The name stuck. And the tribes call themselves, because it's that anyway. But as foster parents, we had, quite a few foster brothers and sisters over the years. When I was in high school, we had several different ones, and then they continued after I'd gone to college. My younger siblings knew all the other ones that they worked with. The main foster brother that I remember well and appreciate is Garrett Wounded Head, Nata Wakapi, also known as Black Hawk Wounded Head in the Sioux language. And last I heard, he's working as an artist down in Arizona someplace. The plight of the American Indians has been tragic and sad. We know that one of the primary reasons for that is what they called in the day fire water, alcohol. In fact, getting back to Tecumseh for a moment, he was born in the pre-revolutionary era, came of age about the time of the War of 1812, of mature age in his 40s, he recognized very clearly that the tribes addicted to alcohol very quickly. So he preached a doctrine, as did his medicine man brother, no alcohol, stay away from it, no whiskey. And to some degree, the Shawnee did, which is what made them even a more formidable force as far as a fighting force. And we're talking about wars here. They fought wars. They fought the wars against Americans. They fought against the British before that. They didn't fight so much against the French. Excuse me. Because the French weren't trying to settle their land on a wholesale basis like the British and the Americans did. And it's kind of a tragic story. It's a sad story. But it is not an uncommon story of a massive migration of people moving from one place into the edge of a large land, and then because there's so many coming, they just moved right on through. They would ultimately end up in conflict with whatever tribes were already there. Now, we know that America is predominantly the tribe of Manasseh, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Knowing the Bible as we know them, we talk tribes. We know tribes. We know the proclivities of tribes as we read the history of the early days when the tribes were small, when they were 12 brothers, when they hadn't had any kids yet, and so they weren't even yet actual tribes, but they were the patriarchs of the 12 tribes. And Joseph was one. He had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh became the father of what we recognize as America, and there's a reason why the name goes right back to the time of Manasseh, and then Ephraim was the father of the one that became the British, and therefore was the ancestor of the British Empire. Those are have to do with prophecies that are fulfilled. We see the prophecies, and we've had Bible studies before, and I will probably do some of those again. You can track the tribes across the continents, tribes of Israel, across the continents and through the centuries, right down to their modern homelands, with very few unanswered questions at the end. They're easy to track when you have the right techniques, which is simply the discipline of studying history, a little bit of archaeology, and a few other aspects like that, but particularly study of history, and especially biblical history, to find the clues that you look for in tracking them through. There was some thought by early Americans that the Indian tribes were descended from the Israelite tribes. Some of them might have been to some degree, or may still be to some degree. That's very, very possible. Let me give you an example, because Tecumseh even made it far enough into the West. It was about 15 to 18 years of traveling constantly and talking to all of these tribes. He met the Mandans, and he had convinced the Mandans to throw in their lot. Well, George Kenton, who's a great American artist from the 1820s and 30s, visited one of the last of the Mandan, I don't know if you really call it a village, it was almost more of a fortress or a small town on the Missouri River. And he painted pictures of them. He found a lot of blondes and redheads among them too. And this was well before there would have been enough Americans out there to have intermarried at all with the tribes. The Mandans were not the typical Indian tribe, which is also what he found that the other tribes said about them. And the best thinking I've read on that subject is that the Mandans were actually Celts, who at some point in time have migrated across the ocean and then moved up the river system, and they had a very extensive series of forts along the Missouri River. So my guess is they came up the Mississippi and then up the Missouri way into the west. And George Kenton does a remarkable artistic studies of various tribes. He would actually go to them and live there And he would write down what he could of their history, as well as painting their villages and their leaders and their people at the time. So if you go back and find his work, I think you'll find a very interesting review. There is also the potential, therefore, that some of the other tribes had some Israelite DNA. One of the interesting tidbits that came out just recently, this was in the U.S. News in 2013. Great surprise. Native Americans have West Eurasian origins. Eurasia means Europe and Asia. And the western part of that is the Middle East. So they come from the middle, they have a significant amount of DNA that comes from there. It's an interesting article which messes with anthropologists' minds, because they had it all set that all the tribes are of Eastern Asian origin, and they crossed the Bering Strait on a land bridge that doesn't exist anymore. It's not that far between Russia and Alaska when you get to the Bering Strait. Just a few miles, you can actually see across. And they said there was a land bridge there, and they came across. I don't know why they needed a land bridge. Just come in the wintertime, it's frozen anyway. But they claimed it was a land bridge. And there is very likely, I think I've read a number of books, and we'll get into some of these overview in another study. The land bridge theory may in fact be true for some. There are definite physical characteristic differences of West Coast Indians and Alaskan ones as compared to those that are further east into the heartland of North America. They don't look the same. They never have. They tend to be beard wearers, or at least a certain degree of beard wearers on the West Coast, and you don't find that proclivity at all when you get into the tribes inland, unless there has been intermarriage with a bushy-faced white man at some point. Typically, most of the tribes are beardless, so it's an interesting aspect of it. What we want to look at are, at this point now, and I'll toss in a few other historical tidbits as we go. We look at the cultural overview. The American Indian tribes, as we know them, are not particularly ancient. There were cultures in North America and Central America long before. Archaeological remains are everywhere. Mound builders, for example. We call them Indian mounds in Ohio because we don't really read very much history. The Indians didn't build them. They were here when we got here. They didn't know where they came from. It was a culture before them, or two cultures before them. Our tribes that that some people think of as ancient, are really only a few hundred years before the Americans arrived, is when most of the American Indians, as we know them, when most of them arrived. So it's a relatively recent times, maybe early Middle Ages forward, to give you a sense, maybe a little bit before the early Middle Ages, but not too much. There were cultures here. In Ohio is one of the primary places where they study those things. We have the Adena culture and the Hopewell culture, both of which are named after locations in Ohio. Hopewell culture is best known down by Columbus. We lived about 10 miles from Newark, which is east of Columbus, on Highway 16. And in Newark, on a golf course, that's what preserved them, was a golf course, is the giant circle. And it's a circle, a mound, earthen mound circle, the dead straight circle? No, dead circular circle. It's accurately made. The top is level. How do they level it? Probably with mirrors. But that's been there for ages and ages. Before the relatively more modern tribes came, that was already there. Next to it is the even more fascinating octagon. Now, it isn't a solid octagon like a stop sign. This octagon has 8 sides that are kind of juxtapositions, just a little slightly oddly, but generally in the shape of an octagon, which nobody knew what it was for until it began to be verified by a skeptical professor of mathematics from Illinois. This is a few decades ago. It was back when a portable computer could be carried in the back of a big truck. So this is 60s probably, late 60s. He brought his math class over to study the octagon because there were speculations that it was something to do with a calendar. So they measured the legs of the octagon and studied the angles, put all of that data into the computer, and then they said, okay, we're going to see if it's a calendar. They overlaid where the sun would be at different times during the year to see if there was any correlation. And there really wasn't any correlation at all. It didn't make sense. Well, he thought he was vindicated in being a skeptic. So one of the students said, well, Professor, we have the vectors of where the moon is also in the program. We could run that. And he said, go ahead. He found out that each of those sides of the octagon were within 1 or 2 degrees, which is a very tiny amount for a pile of dirt, 1 or 2 degrees in line with the moon as it rose on certain specific dates during the year. It's a calendar calibrator is what it is. Stonehenge in England was based on calendar analysis and probably maintenance. Down at Fort Ancient, which is just north of Cincinnati, right off of Interstate 71, it's actually up, the Little Miami River had carved at some time a big deep canyon. It's right up on top of the ridge, on the canyon ridge, Fort Ancient is. They only excavated there, not within the walls, the mound walls of Fort Ancient, but just outside of them, I believe. A set of posts had at one time been placed, and it looks very much like the setup from Stonehenge. That probably is a calendar as well. We're waiting to hear more details as they analyze it. So there were cultures before the American tribes as we know them. And there are speculations of who they were. One of the main ones is they were Celtic. Some of them probably Phoenician. Well, now we're talking Phoenicians traveling from way back when. Bear in mind that most anthropologists don't agree with that because they're certain that people back then had barely gotten out of the trees. And they're still dragging their knuckles on the ground because they're evolutionists. Therefore, everything moves in the evolutionary way. They don't recognize human intellect above animal intellect. They don't understand the concept of an all-powerful creator. So they're lost. They don't have any clue, really, where where that technology would come from. And we can read, and we do, in, that would be 2 Kings 4, I think, and verse 32. It talks about Solomon's wisdom, but in that section, it talks about that his ships, sailing with the Phoenicians, their fleets would go out for 3 years' journey and bring back all these different things. Most commentators will say, oh yes, they 3 years. They would sail around the Horn of Africa, not around the Cape. They said they would sail around the Horn, meaning going out of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is part of the Red Sea. The Gulf of Suez was the Red Sea where Israel crossed, because that's over on the border with Egypt. The Gulf of Aqaba is that other tongue that comes up to the bottom of Israel. And that's where one of the fleets under Solomon was based. They said they would sail down that, around the Horn of Africa. The Horn is around where Kenya is. So it's barely halfway down Africa. And it would take them a year to do that. These anthropologists never sailed So they have no idea how long it takes to sail a ship around the Horn of Africa. So they would sail down there and they would camp for a year and get things, and then they would sail back for a year. It doesn't take a year to get around the Horn of Africa. You probably could go mostly all the way around Africa and come in on the Mediterranean in a year's time. And sailors don't camp. They live on a boat. They want to go home. They sail where they're going, and they've always been this way. They get what they are supposed to get, and they haul it back. They don't sit for a year camped. So I don't know where the archaeologists, or rather the Bible commentators, get those ideas. It takes 3 years, because it does say they took their journeys for 3 years. That's circumnavigation. That's the time it takes to sail around the world. You can do it faster by steam, and if you got a nuclear boat, you can go even faster yet. But to sail around the world takes 3 years. Magellan's crew proved that. Magellan didn't. He died along the way, but his crew got home. And they showed that it took 3 years. So the Phoenicians were phenomenal seagoers, underestimated in world history for the most part. The Israelites were their partners. They sailed together under Solomon. They were the junior partners to the Israelites. And Egypt was with them in a triad. The first marriage of Solomon was the Egyptian princess, which would be viewed as a political marriage, which then allowed Egypt to be in league with Israel for the trade and the wealth that they could gather that way also, so they wouldn't be fighting each other. And when we look back at that, we see that the potential for placing cultures in the New World pre-existed Columbus by a long time. And by the way, when Columbus got there, there were cultures in place. And they had been there a long time. How did they get there? They had to cross the ocean someplace. It wasn't all the Bering Strait. But the evolutionary thinking says, well, they couldn't possibly have come up with the idea of and the technology to sail around the world. You know, they only found out in the 1830s to the 1860s or 1850s, the U.S. Navy documented where the ocean currents are, which are basically rivers in the ocean. One that we're familiar with is the Gulf Stream or the Gulf Current. The Gulf Current comes around out of the Gulf of Mexico and around Florida, and then it cuts to the north. And it goes right past England, right past Europe, therefore, but off the coast of Ireland and England, right up, and it goes right up to the top of Norway. So halfway up the outside of Norway, which would be near the top of Greenland, if you were coming around to North America again, it has very moderate temperatures. Oh, it's cold, but it's not much colder than here because of that. 40 miles wide, 2,000 feet deep. That's the Gulf Stream. When they documented, it was his name is escaping me at the minute, but he was in charge of the charts and the maps for the U.S. Navy during that time. And he had some theories. He'd been listening to some people. So he used the entire Navy fleet as sort of a data gathering process. He wanted the captains to check for currents. And they did that. And so over about 15 or so years, they actually charted them. Another current that we're familiar with on the west coast is the Japanese current. The Japanese current cuts out of Japan and comes up around Alaska and down the west coast, which gives it a very moderate climate on the west coast. Most people don't think that the ancients could have known of those currents, but they did. Now, there are those who've done research on South Sea Islanders in the Pacific, that they can smell the water and to know when they're in the current, whatever current that they're after. They know where those are to a large extent based on the smell, which is why they built those massive war canoes so they could go and conquer, neighboring islands that they couldn't see. and you're going in a big canoe, you want to be sure that you can get there before your supplies run out. So the knowledge and ability knowledge has been gathered and lost, gathered and lost. Evolutionary thinking tends to focus on the dark ages. When the Roman Empire fell, that was the only dark age in the world's history. No, they've only, and followed by the only Renaissance. Not so. We've had that cycle before. That's just the way of human nature. You build, then you get greedy, and then you fight and you destroy everything. Everything descends into much more primitive darkness. And then they start rediscovering things and gradually build back up again, and they go through the whole process all over again. And we're in the greedy stage right now. So this one's going to be, because the technology has gotten that much higher, it's going to be much more frightening. So now getting back to our American Indian study and the cultural overview, I did a little bit of work. I enjoyed thoroughly reading Freeman's copy of The Frontiersman by Alan Eckert, an an Ohio author. I think it was written in the 60s or so. He wrote a number of books about Ohio in that era. Fascinating read. Extensively covers the various chiefs of the Shawnee, because the main hero, or the main focus of the book, is Simon Kenton, who was one of the great pioneers of the time, and tells his story, tells about Daniel Boone. They were contemporaries and actually good friends. Kenton settled in northern Kentucky, but when he had kids and was planning to actually develop more land, he moved up towards Springfield near Dayton in Ohio. And that's where he lived out his life. He knew Tecumseh personally. He knew Blue Jacket, Black Hoof, and a whole host of the other Shawnee chiefs. He had fought them all at one time or another in his career, and they had fought with him. So it's a fascinating study of the tribes, and Eckert does a very good job of explaining what the tribes were facing and how that was impacting them, as well as what the U.S. pioneers were experiencing as they were moving forward. What happened was you had two warring cultures that hit each other. Not all of America is nearly as warlike as the Scots-Irish. And that's who they hit first. They ran into each other first. The Scots-Irish began to immigrate in the middle 1700s, early to middle, but they came over in vast waves, about 3 million of them. Part in the first wave of a few decades. The second wave came from the late 1700s up to about 1720 or 1820. The early ones would land in Philadelphia, which was your primary port at the time, on the East Coast and the North, and migrate immediately out to the borderlands, out into Pennsylvania, ultimately pressing from there. Once Fort Pitt or Pittsburgh was established, from there they springboarded into Kentucky and Ohio. And then they settled down the Appalachians until the time of the Civil War. And this, by the way, I'm citing from a book called Born to Fight. U.S. Representative Webb, I forget his first name. I'm sure it's not Jack, though. He wrote the book about 10 years ago, Born to Fight. It is the history of the migrations of the Scots-Irish over to America. And when you say Scots-Irish, you think, what do you mean Scots-Irish? Are they Irish or are they Scots? Well, that was never really determined. They didn't get along with the Irish, so when they lived in Ireland, eventually the Irish would get organized enough to drive the Scots-Irish back to Scotland. And they would land in southern Scotland and northern England, the borderlands there, and that's where they lived for several hundred years until they had raised the ire of the Highland Scots and the English so much that they combined and they would fight with them and drive them back to northeastern or Ireland again. And they went back and forth like that over a period of many, quite a few centuries. And then the New World opened up. So the last move was just jump across the ocean to a new land where you don't have to deal with the British, even though it was a British colony at the time, and you can get away from the Irish. And that's where they landed. In this American Civil War, he documents, this Representative Webb, and he's a U.S. House of Representatives, the rank and file soldiers of the Confederate Army were virtually all Scots-Irish. They didn't own slaves, they didn't believe in slavery, but they didn't like being told what to do, which is sort of the keystone of the Scots-Irish. On the Yankee side of the American Civil War, the bulk of the army was also Scots-Irish. Hence you had brothers fighting brothers and all those tragic things. Augmented heavily by Irish who had recently arrived in America and needed work. So the Irish, that was a way to get out of New York City and on to something better for them. So you had Irish and Scots-Irish. In the Northern Army, though, you had many of the officers who were also Scots-Irish. In the South, the officer corps were the genteel Southern gentlemen, Manassites through and through, of a different caliber of Manassite, though. So we have the Scots-Irish then being the fighters. They fought each other tooth and toenail in the American Civil War. Before that, they fought the tribes because they settled right into their territory. They encroached. And it was going to be a battle. And you think, well, why can't they? Wouldn't they stay out of the American Indian tribes' lands? But because when you study the movements of the Indians, they didn't always live where we ran into them. They moved around, either because they conquered a tribe and took their lands, or a tribe conquered them and pushed them someplace else. They were warriors, great warriors, but unfortunately, always warriors. And they happened to run into the Americans, sub-tribe, shall we say, of warriors. And they were a match for each other. They truly were. Pretty amazing. So that's what led, when our American Indians that we think of today, and the American Indian Wars, those around the time of the Revolution, and around the time of 1812. And then there was somewhat of a hiatus. For a few decades, there were smaller skirmishes, and then the Sioux began to be a problem in the 1860s. That's when Red Cloud actually created a confederacy out in the west. He dominated land that was twice the size of Texas because he united the Sioux and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, except that they weren't on foot. They were on horseback, and they were armed. By the 1870s, they weren't armed just with bows and arrows, which were pretty terrifying in their hands. And they had rifles. Custer's Last Stand, the Americans, or the Indians had lever-action rifles. The Army, the U.S. Army, was carrying single shots. So they were outgunned by Crazy Horse and Low Dog and Gall by far. And they knew how to use them. There was nothing cowardly about the American Indian tribes, nor about the Scots-Irish, which is what led to the tragedy of war. It happened. So now we're in James 4, and in the cultural overview, this is where we want to focus for a little bit. Where do wars and fights come from among you? The first question in James 4. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and you do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war. Yet you don't have because you don't ask. You ask and you don't receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, both physically and figuratively, the latter part. The American tribes were a culture of war. And a culture of war is always at risk because it's always fighting. America is not necessarily at its core a war-making culture, but it is capable of it. Very definitely capable of it. When you go back to the time of the judges, you read about Manasseh's warfare, and you realize that among the judges, there were two great war leaders in Manasseh. One was Gideon, and the other was Jephthah. And they were Manassites. Actually, both came from the same general area. They were in the half-tribe territory across the Jordan River on the eastern side. The main body of the Israelites was on the western side between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. So when you have Manassites who are capable of it running up against those who are warriors, this is what happens. The tribes, as a culture, because this is our focus, they always wanted what they didn't have, and so they fought with each other. Before the Americans came, the British and the French came, they fought with each other. They formed their own federations. The Iroquois are also called the Six Nations. There are 6 major Indian tribes that linked together, and they dominated things. Clear out to here, clear out to Ohio. They ruled. And then somebody would get more powerful than them. So this was the culture of the American Indians. And when you realize that, and you realize that this also speaks to the culture of the Israelite tribes, probably James, in writing it, this would be James, the brother of Christ, who was the pastor in Jerusalem. He would probably addressing even the Jews, because the Jews then, in the first century, were always agitating, which is, and we read that in the book of Acts. They rioted pretty often on the Temple Mount. They had a subculture of the Jews who believed in assassination. That subculture or a subgroup escapes me at the moment, because you had the major groups of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and 2 or 3 other ones. So the Jews were, among the fighters too. After James wrote this, some decades, there was to be the last great Jewish wars of the ancient world. The first was from 66 to 70 A.D. That's called in Roman terms the First Jewish War, because they fought Rome. And they held their own pretty remarkably, because they were tough fighters. I mean, look at our modern Israelis today. But Rome was massive, and Romans were good fighters too. And they lost. They lost. The temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. Jerusalem was destroyed. They were kept away from Jerusalem. By law, they couldn't even go near it for a long time. And then you think, well, they must have learned their lesson from that, but the Jews didn't. 50 years later, in the 130s, 60 years later, in the 130s, from 132 to 135, there was a second Jewish war. And they lost hundreds, probably 1 million or more Jews died in the first war, but by, a couple generations later, they were feeling their oats, I guess. And in the second war, they lost even more. That was also known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. Simon Bar Kokhba was the leader of it. So when James is writing, he knew the proclivities even of the Jewish Israelites, that they too were warriors when pressed in that direction. So when viewing the American Indians, then we see a commonality that is common to mankind. The Israelites and the American Indians are not the only warrior cultures. There are other ones. The time of Genghis Khan, the Chinese had a phenomenal warrior culture, and the Mongols did. You will find that in Europe. There were different warrior cultures. Germany is one of the most recent ones to raise its head as, war at all costs. The Slavs in Russia, they were warriors as well. So we have this as the wrong way of man's thinking. Let's go on and look at a little bit more of it. Let's see, we left off in the middle of verse 3. You ask and don't receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures. In verse 4, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit which dwells in us yearns jealously? Then you think, well, the American Indian tribes didn't know about God. But they knew of the concept. Virtually all cultures knew the concept of God. In that general sense, they had some inkling. Of course, the Israelites and the Jews, especially the Jews, having the knowledge of being the preservers of Scripture, they definitely knew about God, and yet they ignored what they knew. But the tribes, American tribes like the other tribes, American Indian tribes like the other tribes, lived a warrior culture and suffered the consequences of that. And when we think about that, is that all there is to it? In verse 6 it says, but he gives more grace, therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you, whoever you are. Those who really fully understand the Bible and those who only understand an inkling of it. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. Draw near to God and he'll draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. These are the warriors. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. And it goes on with some added instruction in that regard, but this is a cultural overview of virtually all nations, but it most certainly applied to the American Indians in the sense of being warriors. And I've studied elements of their history of different tribes across the United States, reading about them in various books, living among the Oglala in the Dakotas, and then knowing numbers of the tribes out west as well. They were all warrior cultures. There's one tradition, because I carve longbows, and not for war, these are for hunting and target shooting. But a two-fingered bow is a boy's bow. Two fingers means it's that wide, so it's a weak bow, but a boy, it's just right for a boy. Two fingers bow. Three-finger bow is a deer bow. And then this is from the tribes that are on the west coast, and they use yew wood for their bows. Four fingers is a war bow, a very powerful bow. And I've tried to make one of those. I'm not done with it because it's also called the elk bow. So it's for a really big game. But it was typically called the war bow, one that was 4 fingers wide. The tribes further to the east in the Rocky Mountains and then out into the plains where I grew up near the Black Hills, they didn't have bows that were as wide as those bows in the west. Theirs were slightly narrower, but they glued sinew on the back of their bows. And they had adapted their archery for horses. Whenever horses were brought over, most think the Spanish brought them, but then there are others who think they actually were here to some degree before the Spanish arrived. But with the sinew backing on these short bows, and the buffalo hunting bows, which were also the war bows of the Sioux, were at the most about 1 meter long, and at the least maybe 30, 32 inches. That's not a very long bow, considering you're going to pull it and to shoot a buffalo. The secret was the sinew is super strong, much stronger than the wood. And so they were pulling at a short little pull, they were pulling 70 or 80 pounds, which would shoot an arrow right through a buffalo when they're riding alongside it. I mean, through the buffalo and stick in the ground on the other side. So they knew how to make the weapons that they needed for hunting, but they also used those on people. So understanding the cultural overview of that, when we get into the next one, we'll go back and look at the more ancient origins of where the tribes came from. I want to just whet your appetite with one or two thoughts on that. Number one, as I pointed out, the article that is commented on in National Geographic that came out 2 years ago, that this particular DNA study, it was from the arm bone of a 3-year-old from, they found it at Lake Mikhail in Russia. And they believe that that was where the Native Americans of the U.S. originated because of the land bridge theory. But that's all in question now because they find out that they have Middle Eastern connections. Well, that brought to mind another historian that I read who tracks the tribes of Israel primarily. But bear in mind, everybody came from Adam and Eve. And then they were all kind of bottlenecked back down. They came from Noah's family. Everybody, all the clans and nations we know today all came out of Noah's family because they were the only 8 people that survived the flood. Therefore, we're going to see ancient relationships between the different tribes that we can expect to a certain degree will pattern and will be maintained, probably under different identifying names, but still be maintained. One historian comments that he thinks, based on his research, and I haven't seen all of that he's written on this, only a little bit of it, but it does sound intriguing. He believes that the sons of Kedar, Kedar was the name of one of the sons of Ishmael in the book of Genesis. Ishmael, as you know, was the half-brother of Isaac. The promise came through Isaac. Ishmael became the father, for the most part, of the Arabs. The Arab nations were, he had 12 sons, and he was a great man and had great populations that came from him. But a branch of Kedar migrated north and east, according to this historian, and ultimately came either across the Pacific into the Americas or the land bridge, may have crossed there, and became the progenitor of a great many of the American tribes. Not all, because the physical characteristics change from west coast to east coast quite significantly. But that's one of his theories, is that in fact, where Ishmael and Isaac were located close to each other, just like the Israelis and the Arabs are located close to each other now, that we have another branch of some of we would normally think of them as Arabs, except the Arab title came much later. They weren't called Arabs back in the day. They were the sons of Ishmael. And that relationship followed another vein and came back to where some of the tribe of Manasseh settled. And here, wouldn't you know it, according to his thinking, you find the descendants of Kedar, who was an Ishmaelite. So that's one theory with some significant potential, and we'll explore that one a little bit more. And then we have another treatise that was written, that I read recently, and that is that the bulk of the tribes actually did come across the Atlantic, both for South and North America, not necessarily for the west coasters of either side, but for the eastern coast and the inlands. And that's where the tribes came from, some from Egypt, some from the Philistines, not who I'm thinking of, Tyre and Sidon. They weren't Philistines. Which? Phoenicians, thank you, which is a Greek word. The Greek word Phoenician was applied to the Israelites as well. It didn't apply to them because the Phoenicians were in Tyre and Sidon. But the Phoenicians were the great sailors. The name just escaped me briefly. Thank you. So this this fellow's thesis and concept is that they found their way across the oceans. When in the technology with the Phoenicians, it was entirely capable. The Egyptians could have had the same kind of technology. Just big sailing ships is basically all you have to have. And then they think, well, they didn't have compasses. You can make a compass. You got a needle and a piece of thread, you can make a compass. You don't even need the thread. Float it on a leaf. Or rub it on your clothes to magnetize it. Float it on a leaf in a little container of water, and it'll point north. You know, you don't need super technology, but there have been discoveries of remarkable technological things, you know, calibrated to calculate distances and times and such, that have been discovered over the past few years, usually ignored by the mainstream archaeologists because it doesn't fit in with being knuckle draggers in the past and the bright people are only now. You know, the evolutionary theory throws them way off the track of really following history as it should. But his thesis is that the bulk of the tribes came from Europe and the Middle East and landed on the East Coast, and then they moved inland. So in either way, we're getting a blending of the two at some point, and some of them all, you know, being related as well. So that's we'll go ahead and conclude the Bible study at this point, and we'll have part 2 in a month or two, and then part 3 sometime after that on the origins of the American Indians.